continues. Once again, Gwen Ifill and Judy Woodruff.
Welcome back to the Democratic presidential debate. Before we return to our questions, we have a follow-up question from our Facebook group. And it is to Senator Sanders. Senator, it comes from Bill Corfield. He's a 55-year-old musician from Troy, Ohio. And he asks, are there any areas of government you'd like to reduce?
Well, many. Hey, I'm in the United States Senate, and anyone who doesn't think that there is an enormous amount of waste and inefficiency and bureaucracy throughout government would be very, very mistaken. I believe in government, but I believe in efficient government, not wasteful government.
How about you, Senator Clinton? Secretary Clinton.
Absolutely. And, you know, there are a number of programs that I think are duplicative and redundant and not producing the results that people deserve. There are a lot of training programs and education programs that I think can be streamlined and put into a much better format so that if we do continue them, they can be more useful in public schools, community colleges, and universities. I would like to take a hard look at every part of the federal government and really do the kind of analysis that would rebuild some confidence in people, that we're taking a hard look about what we have, you know, and what we don't need anymore. And that's what I intend to do.
If I could just add to that. We have also got to take a look at the waste and inefficiencies in the Department of Defense, which is the one major agency of government that has not been able to be audited. And I have the feeling you're going to find a lot of cost overruns there and a lot of waste and duplicative activities.
We spent the first part of this debate talking about domestic insecurity. The second part, we want to talk about our foreign policy insecurities, and we want to start with a question for you, Secretary Clinton, about America's role in the world. Americans are becoming increasingly worried that attacks abroad are coming home, that they already are in fact here. According to exit polls from earlier this week, more than 2/3 of Democrats in New Hampshire are concerned about sending their children to fight in wars they can't win. They fret that the next attack is just around the corner, and we are not ready. Are we?
Look, I think we are readier than we used to be, but it's a constant effort that has to be undertaken to make sure we are as ready as we need to be. We have made a lot of improvements in our domestic security since 9/11. And we have been able to foil and prevent attacks, yet we see the terrible attack in San Bernardino and know that we haven't done enough. So we have to go after this both abroad and at home. We have to go after terrorist networks, predominantly ISIS. That's not the only one, but let's focus on that for a minute. We have to lead a coalition that will take back territory from ISIS, that is principally an American-led air campaign that we are now engaged in. We have to support the fighters on the ground, principally the Arabs and the Kurds, who are willing to stand up and take territory back from Raqqa to Ramadi. We have to continue to work with the Iraqi army so that they are better prepared to advance on some of the other strongholds inside Iraq, like Mosul, when they are able to do so. And we have to cut off the flow of foreign funding and foreign fighters, and we have to take on ISIS online. They are a sophisticated purveyor of propaganda, a celebrator of violence, an instigator of attacks using their online presence. Here at home, we've got to do a better job coordinating between federal, state, and local law enforcement. We need the best possible intelligence, not only from our own sources, but from sources overseas that can be a real-time fusion effort to get information where it's needed. But the final thing I want to say about this is the following. You know, after 9/11, one of the efforts that we did in New York was, if you see something or hear something suspicious, report it. And we need to do that throughout the country, but we need to understand that American Muslims are on the front line of our defense. They are more likely to know what's happening in their families and their communities, and they need to feel not just invited, but welcomed within the American society. So when somebody like Donald Trump and others stirs up the demagoguery against American Muslims, that hurts us at home. It's not only offensive, it's dangerous. And the same goes for overseas, where we have to put together a coalition of Muslim nations. I know how to do that. I put together the coalition that imposed the sanctions on Iran, that got us to the negotiating table to put a lid on their nuclear weapons program. And you don't go tell Muslim nations you want them to be part of a coalition when you have a leading candidate for president of the United States who insults their religion. So this has to be looked at overall, and we have to go at it from every possible angle.
Senator Sanders, what is...
Let me just say this. What a president of the United States has got to do, and what is his or her major, I think, responsibility, is to, A, make certain that we keep our people safe, that we work with allies around the world to protect democratic values, that we do all that we can to create a world of peace and prosperity. I voted against the war in Iraq because I listened very carefully to what President Bush and Vice President Cheney had to say, and I didn't believe them. And if you go to my website, berniesanders.com, what you find is not only that I helped lead the opposition to that war, but much of what I feared would happen, what I spoke on the floor of the House, in fact, did happen in terms of the instability that occurred. Now, I think an area, in kind of a vague way, or not so vague, where Secretary Clinton and I disagree, is the area of regime change. Look, the truth is that a powerful nation like the United States, certainly working with our allies, we can overthrow dictators all over the world. And God only knows Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. We could overthrow Assad tomorrow if we wanted to. We got rid of Gaddafi. But the point about foreign policy is not just to know that you can overthrow a terrible dictator. It's to understand what happens the day after. And in Libya, for example, the United States, Secretary Clinton, as Secretary of State, working with some other countries, did get rid of a terrible dictator named Gaddafi. But what happened is a political vacuum developed. ISIS came in and now occupies significant territory in Libya and is now prepared, unless we stop them, to have a terrorist foothold. But this is nothing new. This has gone on 50 or 60 years, where the United States has been involved in overthrowing governments. Mossadegh back in 1953. Nobody knows who Mossadegh was. Democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. He was overthrown by British and American interest because he threatened oil interest of the British. And as a result of that, the Shah of Iran came in, terrible dictator. As a result of that, you had the Iranian Revolution coming in, and that's where we are today. Unintended consequences. So I believe, as president, I will look very carefully about unintended consequences. I will do everything I can to make certain that the United States and our brave men and women in the military do not get bogged down in perpetual warfare in the Middle East.
If I could just respond. Two points. One, Senator Sanders voted in 1998 on what I think is fair to call a regime change resolution with respect to Iraq, calling for the end of Saddam Hussein's regime. He voted in favor of regime change with Libya, voted in favor of the Security Council being an active participant in setting the parameters for what we would do, which, of course, we followed through on. I do not believe a vote in 2002 is a plan to defeat ISIS in 2016. It's very important we focus on the threats we face today and that we understand the complicated and dangerous world we're in. When people go to vote in primaries or caucuses, they are voting not only for the president, they are voting for the commander-in-chief. And it's important that people really look hard at what the threats and dangers we face are and who is best prepared for dealing with them. As we all remember, Senator Obama, when he ran against me, was against the war in Iraq. And yet, when he won, he turned to me, trusting my judgment, my experience, to become Secretary of State. I was very honored to be asked to do that and very honored to serve with him those first 4 years.
Judy, if I can, there is no question, and Secretary Clinton and I are friends, and I have a lot of respect for her, that she has enormous experience in foreign affairs. Secretary of State for 4 years. You got a bit of experience, I would imagine. But judgment matters as well. Judgment matters as well. And she and I looked at the same evidence coming from the Bush administration regarding Iraq. I led the opposition against it. She voted for it. But more importantly, in terms of this Libya resolution that you've noted before, this was a virtually unanimous consent. Everybody voted for it, wanting to see Libya move toward democracy. Of course, we all wanted to do that. That is very different than talking about specific action for regime change, which I did not support.
You did support a UN Security Council approach, which we did follow up on. And look, I think it's important to look at what the most important counterterrorism judgment of the first 4 years of the Obama administration was, and that was the very difficult decision as to whether or not to advise the president to go after bin Laden. I looked at the evidence. I looked at the intelligence. I got the briefings. I recommended that the president go forward. It was a hard choice. Not all of his top national security advisors agreed with that. And at the end of the day, it was the president's decision. So he had to leave the Situation Room after hearing from the small group advising him, and he had to make that decision. I'm proud that I gave him that advice, and I'm very grateful to the brave Navy SEALs who carried out that mission.
Judy?
Yeah.
One area, very briefly.
Just the final word.
Where the Secretary and I have a very profound difference. In the last debate, and I believe in her book, very good book, by the way, in her book and in this last debate, she talked about getting the approval or the support or the mentoring of Henry Kissinger. Now, I find it rather amazing, because I happen to believe that Henry Kissinger was one of the most destructive secretaries of state in the modern history of this country. I am proud to say that Henry Kissinger is not my friend. I will not take advice from Henry Kissinger. And in fact, Kissinger's actions in Cambodia, when the United States bombed that country, overthrew Prince Sihanouk, created the instability for Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to come in, who then butchered some 3 million innocent people, one of the worst genocides in the history of the world. So count me in as somebody who will not be listening to Henry Kissinger.
Secretary Clinton.
Well, I know journalists have asked who you do listen to on foreign policy, and we have yet to know who that is.
Well, it ain't Henry Kissinger, that's
fine.
for sure.
That's fine. You know, I listen to a wide variety of voices that have expertise in various areas. I think it is fair to say, whatever the complaints that you want to make about him are, that with respect to China, one of the most challenging relationships we have, his opening up China and his ongoing relationships with the leaders of China is an incredibly useful relationship for the United States of America. So if we want to pick and choose, and I certainly do, people I listen to, people I don't listen to, people I listen to for certain areas, then I think we have to be fair and look at the entire world, because it's a big, complicated world out there.
It is.
And yes, people we may disagree with on a number of things may have some insight, may have some relationships that are important for the president to understand in order to best protect the United States.
I mean, it's just a very different, historical perspective here. Kissinger was one of those people during the Vietnam era who talked about the domino theory. Not everybody remembers that. You do, I do. The domino theory. You know, if Vietnam goes, China, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's what he talked about. The great threat of China. And then after the war, this is the guy who, in fact, yes, you're right, he opened up relations with China and now pushed various type of trade agreements resulting in American workers losing their jobs as corporations move to China, the terrible authoritarian communist dictatorship he warned us about. Now he's urging American companies to shut down and move to China. Not my kind of guy.
Senator, let me move on to another country with which the U.S. has a complicated relationship, Senator Sanders, and that's Russia. On the one hand, we're aware that Russia is a country that the United States needs to cooperate with. Just tonight, Secretary of State John Kerry has announced what appears to be an agreement with the Russians to that could lead toward a ceasefire in Syria. It would be the first cessation of conflict in that country in that civil war in 5 years. But it comes at a very high price, because not only have we seen the deaths, the removal of so many people, millions of people, we now see the Russians in the last few weeks have bombed in a way that benefits President Assad, has not gone after ISIS. So my question to you is, when it comes to dealing with Russia, how hard are you prepared to be? Are you prepared to institute further economic sanctions? Would you be prepared to move militarily if Russia moves on Eastern Europe? It seems to me that Russia recently has gotten the better of the United States.
Well, this is what I would say. It is a complicated relationship. I congratulate Secretary of State John Kerry and the President for working on this agreement. As you've indicated, what is happening in Syria, the number of people, the hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed, men, women, 20,000 children, the people are forced to flee their own countries, their own country. It is unspeakable. It is a real horror. Now, what I think is that right now we have got to do our best in developing positive relations with Russia. But let's be clear. Russia's aggressive actions in the Crimea and in Ukraine have brought about a situation where President Obama and NATO, correctly, I believe, are saying, you know what, we're going to have to beef up our troop level in that part of the world to tell Putin that his aggressiveness is not going to go unmatched, that he is not going to get away with aggressive action. I happen to believe that Putin is doing what he is doing because his economy is increasingly in shambles, and he's trying to rally his people in support of him. But bottom line is, the president is right. We have to put more money. We have to work with NATO to protect Eastern Europe against any kind of Russian aggression.
Well, with respect to Syria, I really do appreciate the efforts that Secretary Kerry has made. The agreement on humanitarian relief now needs to be implemented because there are enclaves that are literally filled with starving people throughout Syria. The agreement on a ceasefire, though, is something that has to be implemented more quickly than the schedule that the Russians agreed to. You know, the Russians wanted to buy time. Are they buying time to continue their bombardment on behalf of the Assad regime to further decimate what's left of the opposition, which would be a grave disservice to any kind of eventual ceasefire? So I know Secretary Kerry is working extremely hard to try to move that ceasefire up as quickly as possible. But I would add this, you know, the Security Council finally got around to adopting a resolution. At the core of that resolution is an agreement I negotiated in June of 2012 in Geneva, which set forth a ceasefire and moving toward a political resolution, trying to bring the parties at stake in Syria together. This is incredibly complicated because we've got Iran as a big player. In addition to Russia, we have Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others who have very important interests in their view. This is one of the areas I've disagreed with Senator Sanders on, who has called for Iranian troops trying to end the civil war in Syria, which I think would be a grave mistake, putting Iranian troops as we get a ceasefire and maybe some humanitarian corridors, that still leaves the terrorist groups on the doorstep of others in Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and the like. So we've got some real work to do, and let's try to make sure we actually implement what has been agreed to with the Russians.
Let me just say this. For a start, the Secretary and I disagree, and I think the President does not agree with her, in terms of the concept of a no-fly zone in Syria. I think you do have a humanitarian tragedy there, as I mentioned a moment ago. I applaud Secretary Kerry and the President for trying to put together this agreement. Let's hope that it holds. But furthermore, what we have got to do, I'm sorry, yeah, I do believe that we have got to do everything that we can, and it will not happen tomorrow. But I do hope that in years to come, just as occurred with Cuba, 10, 20 years ago, people say, reach normalized relations with Cuba. And by the way, I hope we can end the trade embargo with Cuba as well. But the idea that we someday maybe have decent relations with Iran, maybe put pressure on them so they end their support for terrorism around the world, yeah, that is something I want to achieve. And I believe that the best way to do that is to be aggressive, to be principled, but to have the goal of trying to improve relations. That's how you make peace in the world. You sit down and you work with people. You make demands of people. In this case, demanding Iran stop the support of international terrorism.
Well, I respectfully disagree. I think we have achieved a great deal with the Iranian nuclear agreement to put a lid on the Iranian nuclear weapons program. That has to be enforced. Right. Absolutely, with consequences for Iran at the slightest deviation from their requirements under the agreement. I do not think we should promise or even look toward normalizing relations because we have a lot of other business to get done with Iran. Yes, they have to stop being the main state sponsor of terrorism. Yes, they have to stop trying to destabilize the Middle East, causing even more chaos. Yes, they've got to get out of Syria. They've got to quit sponsoring Hezbollah and Hamas. They've got to quit trying to ship rockets into Gaza that can be used against Israel. We have a lot of work to do with Iran before we ever say that they could move toward normalized relations with us.
We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. But I recall when Secretary Clinton ran against then-Senator Obama. She was critical of him for suggesting that maybe you want to talk to Iran, that you want to talk to our enemies. I have no illusion. Of course you're right. Iran is sponsoring terrorism in many parts of the world, destabilizing areas. Everybody knows that. But our goal is, in fact, to try over a period of time to, in fact, deal with our enemies, not just ignore that reality.
But if you're going to quote me, Senator Sanders, from a debate in 2008, quote what I said. The question was, would you meet with an adversary without conditions? I said no. And in fact, in the Obama administration, we did not meet with anybody without conditions. That is the appropriate approach in order to get the results that you are seeking.
No, I think the idea was that then-Senator Obama was wrong for suggesting that it's a good idea to talk to your opponents. It's easy to talk to your friends. It's harder to talk to your enemies. I think we should do both.
Let me move on. You have both mentioned the humanitarian tragedies, which have been an outgrowth in part of what's happened in Syria and in Libya. More than 1 million refugees entered Europe in 2015, another 76,000 just last month. That's about 2,000 arrivals every day. Nearly 400 people have been lost at sea so far this year, crossing the Mediterranean, and there are reports that 10,000 children are missing. If we are leaders in this world, where should the U.S. be on this? What should the United States be doing, Secretary Clinton?
Well, I was pleased that NATO announced just this week that they're going to start doing patrols in the Mediterranean, in the Aegean, to try to interdict the smugglers to try to prevent the kind of tragedies that we have seen all too often. Also, to try to prevent more refugees from coming to the European Union. And it's especially significant that they are working with both Turkey and Greece in order to do this. With respect to the United States, I think our role in NATO, our support for the EU, as well as our willingness to take refugees so long as they are thoroughly vetted and that we have confidence from intelligence and other sources that they can come to our country, we should be doing our part. And we should back up the recent donors conference to make sure we have made our contribution to try to deal with the enormous cost that these refugees are posing to Turkey and to members of the EU in particular. This is a humanitarian catastrophe. There's no other description of it. So we do, as the United States, have to support our friends, our allies in Europe. We have to stand with them. We have to provide financial support to them. We have to provide the NATO support to back up the mission that is going on, and we have to take properly vetted refugees ourselves.
A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to go on a congressional delegation, and I went to one of these Turkish refugee camps right on the border of Syria. And what a sad sight that was. Men, women, children forced out of their homes. And Turkey, by the way, did a very decent thing, providing what was reasonable housing and conditions for those people. It seems to me that given our history as a nation that has been a beacon of hope for the oppressed, for the downtrodden, that I very strongly disagree with those Republican candidates who say, you know what, we've got to turn our backs on women and children who left their home with nothing at all. That is not what America is supposed to be about. So I believe that working with Europe, and by the way, you know, we got some very wealthy countries there in that part of the world. You got Kuwait, and you got Qatar, and you got Saudi Arabia. They have a responsibility as well. But I think this is a worldwide, that the entire world needs to come together to deal with this horrific refugee crisis we're seeing from Syria and Afghanistan as well.
And we have a final question from our Facebook family, and it goes to Senator Sanders. It comes from Robert Andrews. He's a 40-year-old stay-at-home dad in Dover, Massachusetts. He says, the world has seen many great leaders in the course of human history. Can you name two leaders, one American and one foreign, who would influence your foreign policy decisions? And why do you see them as, why are they influential?
You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office in 1933 at a time when 25% of the American people were unemployed. Country was in incredible despair. And he stood before the American people and he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. A profound statement that gave the American people the courage to believe that, yes, we could get out of that terrible depression. And then what he did is redefined the role of government. You know, you had Herbert Hoover before that saying, no, we've got to only worry about the deficit. So what if mass unemployment exists? So what if children are going hungry? That's not the role of the government. And what FDR said, yeah, it is. That we're going to use all of the resources that we have to create jobs, to build homes, to feed people, to protect the farmers. We are a nation which, if we come together, there is nothing that we could not accomplish. And kind of that's what I see our campaign is about right now. In this particular moment of serious crises, saying to the American people, don't give up on the political process. Don't listen to the Trumps of the world and allowing them to divide us. If we re-engage and get involved, yeah, we can have health care for all people. We can make public colleges and universities tuition-free. We do not have to have massive levels of income and wealth inequality. In the same light as a foreign leader, Winston Churchill's politics were not my politics. He was kind of a conservative guy in many respects. But nobody can deny that as a wartime leader, He rallied the British people when they stood virtually alone against the Nazi juggernaut and rallied them and eventually won an extraordinary victory. Those are two leaders that I admire very much.
I certainly agree with FDR for all the reasons Senator Sanders said, and I agree about the role that he played both in war and in peace on the economy and defeating fascism around the world. I would choose Nelson Mandela for his generosity of heart, his understanding of the need for reconciliation. But I want to follow up on something having to do with leadership because, you know, today Senator Sanders said that President Obama failed the presidential leadership test. And this is not the first time that he has criticized President Obama. In the past, he's called him weak. He's called him a disappointment. He wrote a foreword for a book that basically argued voters should have buyer's remorse when it comes to President Obama's leadership and legacy. And I just couldn't disagree more with those kinds of comments. You know, from my perspective, maybe because I understand what President Obama inherited, not only the worst financial crisis, but the antipathy of the Republicans in Congress. I don't think he gets the credit he deserves for being a president who got us out of that ditch, put us on firm ground, and has sent us into the future. And it is the kind of criticism that we've heard from Senator Sanders about our president, I expect from Republicans. I do not expect from someone running for the Democratic nomination to succeed President Obama.
Madam Secretary, that is a low blow. I have worked with President Obama for the last 7 years. When President Obama came into office, we were losing 800,000 jobs a month, 800,000 jobs a month. We had a $1.4 trillion deficit, and the world's financial system was on the verge of collapse. As a result of his efforts and the efforts of Joe Biden against unprecedented, I was there in the Senate, unprecedented Republican obstructionism, we have made enormous progress. But you know what? Last I heard, we lived in a democratic society. Last I heard, a United States senator had the right to disagree with the president, including a president who has done such an extraordinary job. So I have voiced criticisms. You're right, maybe you haven't. I have. But I think to suggest that I have voiced criticism, this blurb that you talk about, you know what the blurb said? Blurb said that the next president of the United States has got to be aggressive in bringing people in to the political process. That's what I said. That is what I believe. President Obama and I are friends. As you know, he came to Vermont to campaign for me when he was a senator. I have worked for his re-election, his first election, and his re-election. But I think it is really unfair to suggest that I have not been supportive of the president. I have been a strong ally with him on virtually every issue. Do senators have the right to disagree with the president? Have you ever disagreed with a president?
Senator,
I suspect you may
Senator,
have.
what I am concerned about is not disagreement on issues, saying that this is what I'd rather do. I don't agree with the president on that. Calling the president weak, calling him a disappointment, calling several times that he should have a primary opponent when he ran for re-election in 2012. You know, I think that goes further than saying we have our disagreements. As a senator, yes, I was a senator. I understand we can disagree on the path forward, but those kinds of personal assessments and charges are ones that I find
Senator,
particularly
if you'd like to
troubling.
you may respond to that, but it's time now for closing statements, and you can use your time for closing statements to do that.
One of us ran against Barack Obama. I was not that candidate. All right. Look, this has been a great debate. A lot of interesting issues have come together. Let me conclude by just saying this. There is no president, in my view, not Hillary Clinton, not Bernie Sanders, who has the capability or the power to take on Wall Street, large campaign donors, the corporate media, the big money interest in this country alone. This campaign is not just about electing a president. What this campaign is about is creating a process for a political revolution in which millions of Americans, working people who have given up on the political process, they don't think anybody hears their pains or their concerns. Young people for whom getting involved in politics is as, it's like going to the moon. It ain't going to happen. Low-income people who are not involved in the political process. What this campaign is not only about electing someone who has the most progressive agenda, it is about bringing tens of millions of people together to demand that we have a government that represents all of us and not just the 1% who today have so much economic and political power. Thank you all very much.
You know, we agree that we've got to get unaccountable money out of politics. We agree that Wall Street should never be allowed to wreck Main Street again. But here's the point I want to make tonight. I am not a single-issue candidate, and I do not believe we live in a single-issue country. I think that a lot of what we have to overcome to break down the barriers that are holding people back, whether it's poison in the water of the children of Flint, or whether it's the poor miners who are being left out and left behind in coal country, or whether it is any other American today who feels somehow put down and oppressed by racism, by sexism, by discrimination against the LGBT community, against the kind of efforts that need to be made to root out all of these barriers. That's what I want to take on. And here in Wisconsin, I want to reiterate, we've got to stand up for unions and working people who have been at the core of the American middle class and who are being attacked by ideologues, by demagogues. Yes, does Wall Street and big financial interests, along with drug companies, insurance companies, big oil, all of it have too much influence? You're right. But if we were to stop that tomorrow, we would still have the indifference, the negligence that we saw in Flint. We would still have racism holding people back. We would still have sexism preventing women from getting equal pay. We would still have LGBT people who get married on Saturday and get fired on Monday. And we would still have governors like Scott Walker and others trying to rip out the heart of the middle class by making it impossible to organize and stand up for better wages and working conditions. So I'm going to keep talking about tearing down all the barriers that stand in the way of Americans fulfilling their potential, because I don't think our country can live up to its potential unless we give a chance to every single American to live up to theirs.
Thank you.
Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And we want to thank our audience, our quiet audience here in the Helen Bader Concert Hall, and all of you watching at home. Thank you all. Stay tuned for analysis of the debate and the overall race for the Democratic nomination. That's coming up next here on PBS stations and online at pbs.org/newshour.
I'm going to remain here in Milwaukee tomorrow evening for a special edition of Washington Week here on PBS.
And I'm going to be returning to Washington. I hope you'll join us for the PBS NewsHour tomorrow and every night. That's it from all of us here in Milwaukee. We thank you.
Good night.